If you have labeled your child as a perfectionist or as someone who tends to be hard on themselves, there's a chance they have what therapists call a negative self-assessment style. Well, my next guest says that many young people tend to be very self-critical in their thinking patterns, which ultimately can lead to low self-esteem and self-worth. But it's never too late to help your child develop a more positive self-assessment style instead. Psychologist and good friend of our show, Dr. Tom Golightly, joining me in studio to share how. It's great to see you.
Thanks for having me.
Busy season for you. Thanks
Yes,
for
ma'am.
making time.
No problem.
So can you explain in more detail the difference between a positive self-assessment style and a negative self-assessment style?
Sure. So we have these tendencies when we look at events and we have certain outcomes, we assign meaning to those outcomes. And a more positive self-assessment style sees a positive outcome and says, I did something to make that happen, and sees a negative outcome and says, hey, there are things I can work on. A more negative self-assessment style, when something good happens, it's lucky, I kind of dumbed into it. And when a negative event kind of happens in their life, it's like, I caused it, this is what I did, how did I make this happen, and I can do things to avoid negative outcomes, which is really highly inaccurate.
Okay, now I know what I'm asking here. It's the million-dollar question, but does the research tell us, or do we know, is this built into our personality, kind of how we become who we are, or is this learned, is this developed?
It tends to be more of a learned behavior in what we do, and it tends to come from environments that are really strict, rule-based environments.
Interesting.
So, you know, think of those really strict environments that there might be in all of those contexts, but it also comes from high pressure performance situations. So when we look at kids that are at universities and honors level classes, those types of things, it can really come into play where they're feeling a demand and a time pressure to perform in a certain situation.
Tom, you told my producer you've noticed this in some of the young patients landing in your office, this tendency toward a more negative self-assessment style. Is it generational? Are we seeing kind of a trend here?
I think it's, well, because it's learned, they had to learn it somewhere, right? And so I'm guessing, you know, that in a lot of my clients that are maybe a little bit more mature, they have similar styles as well. And it's something that might not just be overly prominent in this generation. It's probably been around for a really, really long time.
Been around. We might just be seeing it or noticing it in a different way.
Exactly. I think as we break it down and we learn more about, you know, where some of these depressive or anxious thoughts might come from, you know, we can kind of see, hey, here's some genesis to it, and here's what keeps us holding on to these things.
Which I think is important, and I would love to see more energy kind of focused toward the root, like before it takes off and becomes a consuming problem. So before we get into how we might flip it, if this is a tendency in a child or a grandchild we love, anything we can do to create or curate a more healthy atmosphere in general at home?
Well, I think one thing is how are we evaluating and seeing and how are we discussing things. I know that there are times when I was working on something at home and I might have dropped something and I'm like, oh, and I might say, you know, something, you know, critical toward myself. What do my little kids see? They see me being critical towards myself. And if we can kind of model more accepting and compassionate behavior towards ourselves, our kids might pick that up along with it.
You referenced, though, kind of a rule set or a tone in the home where things are strict and maybe precise behavior is expected. Can we afford to soften there if that describes maybe the environment that we're creating?
Well, I think some of how we correct can be an important component to that, too. Shame-based, like, hey, instead of making it a trait, like, hey, you're a bad person, or you're a bad kid, or you're an angry child. It's like, no, we can kind of point out the behavior, make some suggestions and some corrections without being overly shaming with it. So it's not necessarily changing the rule, but maybe how we deliver the correction.
How we approach it. 5 ways, in addition to all the great advice you've shared, 5 ways we can help encourage kids to build a more positive self-evaluation. First, you say connecting the bridge between expectations and self-judgment is important.
Oh my goodness, expectations, they just cut us off at the knees, and a lot of times we just have this idea in mind that life has to go one way. And when it doesn't go that way, we tend to get really upset and really mad at ourselves for not being able to make it go that way. And so it's really important to kind of connect. You know, expectation is future, right? And we've actually done some studies on this. Humans are really bad at predicting the future, like comically bad, like 95% wrong with our anxious thoughts. So if we're trying to predict what the outcome is going to be, we're going to be wrong most of the time. And it limits us. It limits the power of positive outcomes, because we'll see the positive outcome and say, well, I expected that. Or if it's a negative outcome, it's like, well, see, and this is why I'm a failure, right?
Right,
So,
right.
so expectations really kind of cap our power to improve.
You say curiosity is one way to cut through those expectations, ask questions, get curious. And you say as parents, as grandparents, we've got to be focusing on progression.
So we tend to, there's two problems with how the opposite of that, which is perfection, that things have to be perfect in a certain sense. It's that one, it limits to two options. It either went awesome or it went terrible. And there's no nuance. And very rarely do I attend an event that it's like, that's all bad or that's all good. It's like, what three things went well? And what's something that if you could change, you would have changed? So being able to approach things with a little bit more nuance. And the second problem is it tends to pull our focus to the outcome. And when we're talking about trying to create certain outcomes, focusing on our process and trusting our process creates more preferred outcomes. So we're kind of skipping over the process, focusing on the outcome, and really eliminating our ability to be nuanced in how we evaluate.
We know as parents we should avoid judgment, but you say a way to help us get there, right, to that more value practice parenting is to focus on observations.
It seems simple. It's very tricky.
I like simple.
And but it's complicated and takes some skill. But we tend to rush to judgment after events. It's like, how did this go wrong? And recently I was even with some athletes after an event, and I could hear them having discussion about da-da-da-da-da-da, and you know, this went wrong and this went wrong. It's like, whoa, now's not the time for that. Let the emotion be.
Yeah.
We're gonna get to this, and you're gonna go film on this, and you're gonna get really good feedback on what you can do. But if we're in that emotional moment, we're making a judgment about ourselves, about how it went. And if we can kind of be clinical in some ways and just be like a coach, like a teacher, and say, here's X, Y, and Z. And on Monday, all of those athletes came back to me and said, you saved me from a weekend of misery.
Good.
And I am much more capable of learning from this because I didn't judge myself then. We can be more clinical in how we observe.
And there comes the growth with just a little bit of
Exactly.
time. All right, when we come back, Tom will share the final and perhaps most important way parents can help their children develop this positive assessment style. We'll talk about it next. Welcome back to Studio 5. I am here with Dr. Tom Golightly. He is sharing ways parents can help their children build more positive self-evaluations. And you say this last point is really key to this entire parenting effort, and it focuses on the word compassion.
So many times, we all are very quick to give kindness and compassion to other people, but very rarely do we turn that towards ourselves. And I see this with young adults all the time. They really are having a difficult time creating space to be kind to themselves.
Why is that?
I'm not quite sure why that is, but I think they see us do it in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
But one question that I lead with is, if you were on a first date with a person that talks to you the way you talk to yourself inside your head, would you sit through that date? And most of them say, absolutely not. I'd never sit there and take that from another person, but yet we talk to ourselves that way.
So framing it in a social situation that might matter to them helps them maybe see how they can treat themselves.
It gets outside themselves a little bit
Yeah.
and how they can be kind and understand that what they're going through is really normal and a common human experience, and it helps them engage a little bit more mindfully with how they're talking to themselves and evaluating themselves inside in that inner speech.
This was a really interesting topic to explore, so we appreciate your suggestions. And obviously knowing your field of sports psychology applies to a lot of soccer moms out there who are trying to encourage that point of growth, right?
Yes.
And not let those kids beat themselves up too much. Thank you, Tom.
You're
Thank you
welcome.
so much.